In 1872, a merchant ship called the Mary Celeste was found drifting in the Atlantic Ocean. The strange part? The ship was in good condition. Food and water were still on board. Cargo was untouched. The captain's belongings remained. A lifeboat was missing. But every single person on board had vanished. The captain, his wife, his daughter, and 7 crew members were never seen again. To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened. And the closer you look at this case, the more it refuses to let you go. Because this wasn't just a ship that lost its crew. This was a ship that had been sailing on its own through open ocean for 10 days, pointed in exactly the right direction, as though whoever left never planned to stay gone. Before we talk about what happened, we need to talk about the ship itself. Because the Mary Celeste had a history that, in hindsight, reads like a warning nobody paid attention to. She was built in Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia in 1861 and launched under the name Amazon. Within days of her first voyage, her first captain fell ill and died. On that same maiden voyage, she struck a fishing weir off the coast of Maine and needed immediate repairs. Before the year was out, she collided with another vessel in the English Channel. By the time she was 12 years old, she had passed through a succession of owners, been damaged multiple times, and developed a reputation among sailors as the kind of ship you didn't feel comfortable aboard. In 1868, she was acquired at a salvage auction, repaired, re-registered under American ownership, and renamed. Amazon was gone. Mary Celeste was born. In October of 1872, a man named Benjamin Spooner Briggs arrived at Pier 50 on the East River in New York City to oversee the loading of her cargo. Briggs was 37 years old, Massachusetts born, the son of a sea captain, and by every account available to us, a thoroughly decent and capable man. He was known in shipping circles as both an experienced and a steady officer, deeply religious, completely sober, not prone to panic, and not prone to poor decisions. He'd been sailing for more than a decade. He knew what he was doing. He wrote to his mother shortly before departure to tell her that the ship was in beautiful trim and that he hoped for a fine passage. He was bringing his wife along on the voyage. Sarah Briggs was 30 years old and shared her husband's faith and temperament. The couple's infant daughter, 2-year-old Sophia Matilda, was coming with them. Their older son, Arthur, stayed home in Massachusetts with his grandmother. The decision to bring a wife and baby on a transatlantic voyage wasn't unusual for the era. Captains often did it, especially on what was expected to be a routine crossing. There was no reason to think anything about this trip was going to be different from any other. The cargo loaded into the hold consisted of 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, a highly volatile industrial ethanol, rendered undrinkable with chemical additives, bound for Genoa, Italy, where it would be used in winemaking. At current values, that cargo was worth well over $1 million. The loading was completed under Briggs's personal supervision. His crew of 7 had been selected with care. His first mate, Albert Richardson, had sailed with him before. The second mate, Andrew Gilling, was a New York-born sailor of Danish descent. The ship's steward, Edward Head, had joined on a personal recommendation. 4 German seamen from the Frisian Islands rounded out the roster: brothers Volkert and Bas Lorenzen, Arian Martins, and Gottlieb Goodschall. In a letter home, Briggs described them as a peaceable and capable group. His wife wrote separately to her mother-in-law saying the men appeared quietly competent. Not a single person aboard had any known reason for conflict, criminal history, or instability. On November 7th, 1872, the Mary Celeste left New York Harbor in heavy weather and sailed east, bound for the Mediterranean. She was never seen again with anyone on board. While the Mary Celeste was loading her cargo, Another ship lay at anchor nearby in Hoboken, New Jersey, the Canadian brigantine Dei Gratia under the command of Captain David Morehouse. The Dei Gratia was also headed for Gibraltar and Genoa carrying a cargo of petroleum. Morehouse and Briggs were acquainted, possibly friendly, though the extent of their relationship would later become deeply significant. The Dei Gratia departed 8 days after the Mary Celeste on November 15th, following broadly the same eastward route across the Atlantic. For the first 2 weeks of the voyage, the Mary Celeste's log tells us she fought rough weather, heavy seas, sharp winds, and uncomfortable crossing. Briggs made regular entries. On November 24th, he noted that he'd changed course, heading for Santa Maria Island in the Azores, the last landfall before the long run into the Mediterranean. He expected to see it within a day or two. Something wasn't right, though. The ship was running behind, more than 100 miles further west than it should have been. Briggs may not have known exactly why. His chronometer, the precision clock that ships use to calculate longitude, was later found to be running inaccurate. The Mary Celeste was off course by roughly 120 miles without her captain necessarily being aware of it. The last entry in the captain's log was made at 5 in the morning on November 25th, 1872. It placed the ship 6 nautical miles from the island of Santa Maria. The seas had calmed. The weather had improved. Land was in sight. The entry carried none of the alarm or urgency of a man who suspected anything was wrong. After that, nothing. No more log entries, no more notes from anyone, just silence. On December 4th, 1872, 10 days and nearly 500 miles later, the helmsman of the Dei Gratia spotted something strange on the horizon, a ship moving oddly, her course erratic, her sails misset. Captain Morehouse came up on deck and stared at her for a long time through his glass. He recognized her. He sent his first mate, Oliver DeVoe, across in a small boat to investigate. What DeVoe found when he boarded the Mary Celeste would be repeated in newspaper accounts and maritime records for the next century and a half. The ship was deserted. Not damaged, not sinking. Deserted. The cargo of alcohol was almost entirely intact, with 9 barrels later found to be empty. There was more than 3 feet of water sloshing around in the bilge, which sounds alarming, but under the circumstances was not enough to threaten the ship's seaworthiness. The sails were in some disarray, a few furled, some in poor trim, but she was still sailing. Food was in the galley. The crew's personal belongings were in their bunks. Sophia Briggs's toys were still in the cabin. There was still an impression on the captain's bed from where a small body had last slept there. The ship's clock and the sextant were missing. The ship's papers were gone. The binnacle, the housing for the compass, had been knocked over and its glass cover cracked. And the lifeboat was gone. Not lost, not staved in, lifted from the deck and taken, and that one detail tells us something critical. Whoever left the Mary Celeste didn't fall overboard. They made a deliberate decision to go. What they could not do, could not, never did, was come back. The Dei Gratia's crew brought both ships into Gibraltar, arriving December 12th. The Vice Admiralty Court convened a salvage hearing on December 17th, and what started as a routine maritime procedure quickly turned into something far darker, because the man presiding over the investigation didn't believe a word of the innocent explanation. His name was Frederick Solly Flood, and his title was Attorney General for Gibraltar. He was described by contemporaries as aggressive, combative, and almost constitutionally incapable of accepting straightforward answers. From the moment he laid eyes on the Mary Celeste's condition, Flood believed, without evidence, and stubbornly against the evidence, that something criminal had happened on that ship. His first theory was fraud. He suspected that Morehouse and Briggs, being acquainted, had conspired together to fake the abandonment, collect the insurance and salvage money, and split the proceeds. The problem was that Briggs personally held a stake in the ship and its cargo. He would have lost money on any fraud, not gained it. Flood's theory made no financial sense, and the court quietly set it aside. Flood didn't stop. He sent the ship to be examined by a Gibraltar surgeon named J. Patron, who reported finding what he believed to be bloodstains on the deck, on a railing, and on the blade of a sword found in the captain's cabin. Flood was electrified. He cabled London to report what looked like evidence of a mass killing. Then a second analyst examined the same samples. They weren't blood. The sword was corroded from the sea air and storage, and the marks on the deck were almost certainly old rust or organic staining. The bloodstain theory collapsed completely. Flood had misled the court with his own speculation, and he was furious to be corrected. He proposed a new theory, that the crew had broken into the alcohol cargo, become intoxicated, mutinied against the captain, murdered the Briggs family, and then either fled or been killed themselves. The problem with this theory was equally fatal. The alcohol aboard was denatured industrial ethanol, laced with additives specifically designed to make it undrinkable and dangerous to consume. Nobody was getting drunk on it. The few barrels that were found empty showed no signs of forced entry. They had simply leaked. Flood refused to let go. But eventually, the court found no evidence of foul play, awarded the De Gratia crew a modest salvage payment, far less than they were owed, and sent the Mary Celeste back to sea under a new crew. She would change hands 17 more times before the end came. Every new owner seemed eager to profit from her, and every new owner found that difficult. She had a reputation now. Sailors called her a ghost ship. Some refused to serve on her. Others who did reported an uncomfortable feeling aboard her, a ship that seemed somehow wrong in ways they couldn't quite put into words. In January 1885, 12 years after the crew vanished, the Mary Celeste ran hard aground on the Rocheleau Reef off the coast of Haiti. Her captain, Gilman Parker, had done it deliberately, loading her with junk cargo, over-insuring her, and wrecking her in a scheme to defraud the insurance company. The plan worked, as far as it went. The Mary Celeste went to pieces on the reef, but insurance investigators quickly saw through Parker's scheme, and charges were filed. Parker died before the case went to trial. The wreck of the Mary Celeste was left where it lay, slowly disintegrating in the Caribbean. In 2001, underwater explorer Brian Numm located what he believed were the remains of the Mary Celeste off the coast of Haiti. What he found was a badly eroded hull, consistent with the ship's known dimensions and construction, lying precisely where the historical records placed her final resting point. Nobody had returned to retrieve or preserve her. So what actually happened? Over the following century and a half, almost every possible explanation was tried. Waterspouts, sea monsters, underwater earthquakes, alien abduction, spontaneous combustion, piracy. A short story written by a young Arthur Conan Doyle in 1884, before he invented Sherlock Holmes, turned the Mary Celeste into a sensationalized tale of murder and sea horror, and did enormous damage to the factual record because millions of readers assumed they were reading something based in fact. For decades afterward, journalists and investigators had to fight against the contamination of Conan Doyle's fiction before they could even discuss what the evidence actually showed. What the evidence actually shows is both simpler and more heartbreaking than any of the dramatic theories. The most coherent reconstruction begins with the chronometer. Briggs's clock was running inaccurate, and as a result, the ship was significantly further west than her navigation suggested. For days, He had been expecting to see the island of Santa Maria, and it hadn't appeared. When it finally did, on the morning of November 25th, the ship was not where Briggs thought it should be. She had been fighting rough seas for over 2 weeks. She was off course by more than 100 miles. And there was something else. Briggs had been making regular soundings to measure how much water was in the hold, as any careful captain would. The sounding rod, the tool used to take those measurements, was later found to be inaccurate. More importantly, one of the ship's bilge pumps had been partially disassembled, leaving it non-functional. When the day Grady's men sounded the hold themselves, they found just over 3 feet of water. But if Briggs used a faulty rod with a broken pump, he may have believed there was far more water down there than there actually was. He may have calculated, wrongly but rationally, that the ship was taking on water at a dangerous rate and was in danger of sinking. Down in that hold were 1,701 barrels of volatile denatured alcohol. And here's where the fumes come in. The 9 barrels found empty were made of red oak, a porous wood that can allow alcohol to seep slowly through the staves without ever appearing to leak. As the ship crossed the warm waters of the Atlantic and then encountered cold Atlantic air, the temperature differential inside the hold would have caused those barrels to off-gas, releasing invisible, odorless alcohol vapor into the sealed space below. Experiments, conducted later with similar materials, confirmed that the resulting pressure could have blown the main hatch cover slightly off its seal without leaving visible damage. Researchers in 2006 recreated the effect using barrels, alcohol, and atmospheric conditions modeled on the crossing, and confirmed that a non-destructive but genuinely alarming explosion of vapor was entirely possible. What Briggs would have experienced in that case was sudden, loud, and terrifying. A pressure burst from below, the hatch cover displaced, a rush of colorless fumes into the open air with no visible flame and no obvious damage, but the cargo was alcohol. The hold had just vented. For a captain with a wife and a 2-year-old child aboard who already believed his ship might be taking on water faster than he could manage, who had just been reminded by a loud pressure event that there were nearly 2,000 barrels of flammable cargo beneath his feet, the decision to get off the ship, just temporarily, just long enough to see whether it was about to explode, may have felt entirely rational in the moment. This is the part that makes the Mary Celeste genuinely unbearable to think about, because everything investigators found on the ship points toward a controlled, hurried, but not panicked evacuation. Crew members took time to take the ship's papers. The navigation equipment was removed. The sextant and chronometer went with them. These are not the actions of people who believed they were going to die in the next 30 seconds. These are the actions of people who believed they were leaving temporarily, who expected to come back. The main halyard, the thick rope used to control the mainsail, was found broken and hanging over the side of the ship. The current best reconstruction suggests that the lifeboat was lowered and then tied off to the ship with the halyard so that the 10 people aboard could trail behind at a safe distance from a possible explosion, watching to see what happened, ready to reboard if the danger passed. And then the rope broke. Whether it snapped under the strain of the sea, frayed against the hull, or was cut by accident in the confusion, it parted. And the Mary Celeste, still under partial sail, caught a wind and began to pull away. 10 people in a lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic in November, more than 500 miles from the nearest land, watching their ship sail away from them without anyone at the wheel. They were never seen again. The lifeboat was never found. No bodies were ever recovered. There are no personal accounts from anyone who survived the departure because no one survived. The Atlantic in late November is not a place where people in an open boat last for long. Captain Briggs's son Arthur lived until 1930. He spent his entire life believing his father had been murdered. He never had any evidence for it. He simply couldn't accept that his father, experienced, careful, deeply competent, would have made the chain of errors that seems to be the most honest explanation for what happened. The hard truth is that the Mary Celeste isn't a mystery of monsters or criminals. It's a mystery of small failures compounding, a slow clock, a broken pump, a faulty measurement, a cargo that vented at the wrong moment, a rope that didn't hold. Each individual mistake was understandable. Together they killed 10 people. That's what makes it linger. Not the conspiracy, not the missing bodies, but the knowledge that the people who sailed off the deck of the Mary Celeste on November 25th, 1872, probably thought they were going to be fine. They had no idea that the last thing they would ever see was their own ship, sails filling with wind, course locked toward Europe, sailing on perfectly without them, growing smaller on the horizon until it disappeared. If this one kept you up at night the way it keeps us up, subscribe for more of history's most haunting, unsolved cases. And let us know in the comments, what do you think happened on the Mary Celeste?